Well, we are doing a series called How God Uses Money to Shape Us. And one of my first examples of this happened when I was a first-year student at the seminary. I'd only been a Christian 19 months. I was probably out of 3,500 students in the student body, the rawest Christian in the group. My favorite page in the Bible at the time was the table of contents. When the professor would say, turn to the book of Jeremiah, you know, they're turning to like page 600 and something. I'm turning to page VII, to find out where that is. And so I was just really hungry to learn. And one of my friends called me Hoover, like I was vacuuming up everything I could to learn. I was so enamored with the Bible and learning this, and how could I have missed this growing up? Well, there were two bookstores there. One was right on campus in the student center, and the other one was right across the street. And I ended up buying shoes, books, the way a lot of women buy shoes. You may not need them this week, but someday, you're going to need that pair of shoes. And back then, we didn't have credit cards, but I'd go to the bookstore and I'd get some books, and I'd go and they would we'll just put it on your account, which was sort of like charging it today. And at the end of the month, they would send you a bill, but either bookstore did not expect you to pay the whole thing back. And I was on a really, really tight shoestring budget. And so I might have a bill from one of the bookstores for $30, and I would write a check for $15. And the other bookstore would come in, and it might be for $20, and I'd write a check for $10. And I didn't even think a thing about this. And this kind of went on all year. Well, at the end of the year, suddenly I got a bill where both bookstores at the same time wanted me to pay the entire bill in 1 month. Now, the total of this was only $160. And in today's money, that sounds ridiculous. But this was $1975. And $160 at that point I think I was living on about $50 per month. And I'm thinking, how am I going to do this? Well, one of my friends said, you should go to the seminary and get a loan. And they gave me a no-interest loan for $160. And I wrote 2 checks to each of the 2 bookstores. And the seminary put me on a payment program of 11 months. 10 months, $15 a month. The 11th month, $10 a month. And I'd sort of weathered the storm. Well, what I was about to find out was the truth of Proverbs 22:7. The borrower is slave or servant to the lender. Now, I cannot tell you how galling it was for me to go over to the student center and to see the bookstore just inside over those doors there and know that I had no business walking in that bookstore. I needed to walk by the way an alcoholic would walk by a familiar bar he used to go to. And it galled me that not only could I not buy books, but during the month I had to write a check to the seminary for no books, not getting anything in return. And that went on for 11 months. And it was just maybe like coming off of alcohol or heroin, or shoes for some of you ladies. But I just finally the 11th month came and I wrote a check for $10. And I remember sitting there in the administrative office, and I said, God, I hope to never, ever be in this position again. Please help me. It was my first time to experience debt and what debt can do. Debt is one of those strange things. For a while, I used to collect letters that you get from the credit card companies, and they would send you the card in the mail, like go ahead and start kind of thing, and send it in. And some of the ways that they advertise these cards are so ludicrous. The most common phrase I saw in those cards was, "You deserve it." And I think, if you're an idiot enough like me, maybe you do deserve it. But anyway, I copied down 4 things that are just like, you cannot believe somebody actually wrote this. Number 1, could there possibly be a better way to achieve your financial freedom than to have this credit card? Here's another one. This is an ideal way for you to become the master of your finances. No, I learned how to become the servant to a master of debt. Third one, the ideal way to provide yourself with a little extras that you know you really deserve. And the last one, just click here and receive your shiny new card and start enjoying life. You know, like you haven't been enjoying life up until now, but now finally the doors have opened and I can start enjoying life. Well, I went into my thesaurus and looked up the word debt. And I don't know how many words I copied down here, but it's amazing how many different words are in the English language that relate to debt. For example, some of them have animal imagery to them, like gone to the dogs, fleeced, a wolf at the door. It's pretty good. Some of them have to do with criminality, stripped and tied up. But then there's a bunch of them where if you just pick a letter that you like, there's a whole bunch of them that start with that letter. Like, for example, take the letter B. Bad off, bereft, bereaved, beaten down, beggarly, broken, busted. Any of those will qualify. The letter D. Destitute, deficit, in default, distressed, in difficulty, deadbeat. The letter E. Encumbered, embarrassed, empty. The letter H. Hard up, having seen better days. I, insolvent, in over one's head, in arrears, indigent, impoverished. L, lacking, liable, living hand to mouth. O, obligated, out of pocket. P, paupered, penniless. And the last one R, reduced to ruin, racked and ruined, as if there's sort of a Middle Ages kind of torture there, racked and ruined. That sort of strikes me about that. What I'd like to do in the time we have today is go through 6 dangers that you are slowly sliding towards the debt trap, and then 9 different ways that you can, tools that you can use to help get yourself out of the slavery of debt. The first one is you're living on credit instead of cash. This is what I was doing with those 2 bookstores. I was not paying cash for those books. I was living on credit. Proverbs 3:27 says, don't withhold repayment of your debts. Don't say, some other time, if you can pay now. I mentioned last week that when I was newly married, I had a CPA in the church, back in our church in Texas, that helped me put together a budget. And what I learned was, it's one thing to put a budget together, but it's a whole different thing to manage the budget. And that's where it really gets tricky and where you have to have quite a bit of discipline. And at that point, I did not have that much discipline. And my friend helped me to think about, when do we get paid? We got paid the 15th and the 30th. And what should be paid as soon as possible after those paydays. So one of the things that, and we'll get into this in a little bit more, but he said on the 15th and 30th, the first thing you should do is give to the church and give to yourself, meaning save. We talked about this last week. Because you're trying to turn around this impetus that everything is moving this way for you instead of for your future. And then he mapped out, okay, on the 30th, your rent is due on the 1st. And so most of that check is going to go to the rent. So on the 15th, you're going to have to pay many of your bills on the 15th with that check. And the idea was, do that as soon as you can after the 15th or the 30th, so that you are now not living in fantasy land anymore with all this money we have, because I haven't paid my bills yet. And you are now entering into reality land. Pay all those bills. Now we know how much we have to last for the next 14 days or so. Proverbs 27:1 says, don't brag about tomorrow. You don't know what may happen. This is going into holding up the future as it's going to be okay. Now, I remember, this is just a personal word, and maybe you'll relate to this, but there was something about going into that bookstore, either bookstore, and buying those books that in retrospect sort of remind me of my college days before I became a Christian, and I would get drunk on the weekends. And where the parallel was, on the weekends, there's that initial buzz that you get on your way to being drunk. But and that happens when you're in the bookstore and seeing all these books and the books you're about. There's sort of that buyer's buzz. But the hangover comes the next day. And that was certainly true with me regarding debt. Number 2, delaying payments or paying minimums. That's what I was doing. That's a sign that you're moving in the wrong direction. It's a danger. 3, you're unable to tithe or save. We talked about that last week. Will a man rob God, yet you rob me? Yet you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings. And then savings. Proverbs 21:20. The wise man saves for the future, but the foolish man spends whatever he gets. Number 4, you're unable to pay taxes. Now, this was challenging for me when I was first starting out because as a pastor, you're considered self-employed by Social Security, but an employee by the federal government. And so one of the things I had to learn to do was to set aside taxes for quarterly payments. It is easy to not set that money aside for quarterly payments, but the IRS had my address. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Number 5, extravagant giving. Indulging in luxuries, wine, and food will never make you wealthy. I think that one of the things that strikes me here about this is that it's very easy to substitute buying to try to curb that sense of emptiness or feeling like I'm not that important. It sort of gives the illusion of we're doing pretty good and things are going to be all right. Number 6, get rich quick schemes. I like what Jeff Foxworthy says about this. He says, rich people invest in fine art. Rednecks play the lottery. So that's pretty good. Proverbs 21:5 says, steady plodding brings prosperity. Hasty speculation brings poverty. We looked at, again, this last week. And Ecclesiastes 5:7, dreaming instead of doing is foolishness. Now, as you are listening to this, you may be thinking, oh my gosh, I am already so over my head, I don't know what to do. You may need to get some help. And there are some people in our church that have been down this road that can help you. And if you would like somebody to come alongside of you, please let us know. Now, I'd like to turn to 9 steps to getting out of debt. Number 1, commit to becoming debt-free now. Now, we have had a bunch of people that have been in our church before that have been way over their head in debt. And the question that they ask is, well, is it okay to file bankruptcy? And it is legal to file bankruptcy. That's certainly true. Is it moral to file bankruptcy? Now, there are some situations I've known about where it's just virtually impossible to climb out of debt. There have been a few families I've known like that. But one of the families I think about, and I want to tell their story, is a fellow that decided that he was going to climb out of debt. I'm going to call his name Eddie, and he was in our church almost at the very beginning. And I met Eddie. I actually met his wife first. They were separated. They've been married about 7 years, had a little 1-year-old. And they were living high on the hog. They had a house, they had a pool, they had a pool man, a gardener. They were living the dream. He had his own business. There were 3 of them that owned the business together. His company car was a red Corvette. And he was just living high on the hog outwardly. But inwardly, they had already separated once. And they were getting ready to separate again when the IRS came after his business, and they had not been setting aside any tax money for anybody. And the IRS did not take kindly to that. And when that happened, his 2 partners fled the state. They went into hiding. One of them, he thinks, went to Florida. The other one, he thinks, went into the woods in Northern California. And the IRS came after him for the total tax liability, which again, in the 1980s, mid-80s, was about $50,000. Again, that may not be a lot of money on a tax liability today, but back then, this was overwhelming. And they were coming after him. Now, the business imploded. So not only did he have this $50,000 tax liability, he had no income. And this is the point at which I met him, and he said, can you help me? And so we used to get together for breakfast once a week and just sort of walk through these 9 steps we're going to look at today. He needed to get a job to help pay for now 2 rents, where his wife and son lived and where he was living. He was renting a bedroom in a large house. He had a rented lamp and a rented desk. That was it. The IRS confiscated his car, and he ended up buying a little beater car just to be able to get to work. His first job after all this happened was pumping gas. I don't even know if that job is around anymore in Southern California. You remember pumping gas? Or they used to do that. It's been a long time. But anyway, he did that. Here was this guy living at the very top echelon of wealth, and suddenly it had all just vaporized. But he committed to getting out of debt. He knew it was right, and he had some reasons for doing that. He said, one day, my son is going to deal with finances, and I want to tell him what we did. I want to have a story of what we did. I also want to do it because it's right, as Proverbs 37 says. And also, I want to do it for me. And he said, because every morning I have to look at myself in the mirror. And I don't want to look at myself in the mirror every day thinking I let a whole bunch of family, friends, and companies down with money that I owed them. Number 2, start paying God and yourself first. Honor the Lord with your produce, first fruits of all your harvest, then your barns will be filled to overflowing, your vats will be bursting with wine. Now, my friend not only had a $50,000 debt, the IRS, he had 30 other people or businesses that he owed money to that totaled about $50,000. His total here of debt was about $100,000 in mid-1980s dollars. And but he realized he was going to need a whole lot more help than what he could do on his own. And so giving to the Lord and taking this promise here, then your barns will be filled with overflowing, your vats will be bursting with wine, new wine, he said, I'm counting on that. And he hung on to that promise for about 2 years, tenaciously. And then savings, dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. So he began to do both of these things, very small amounts, but again, trying to move in a very different direction than the headwinds of debt and the way they had been spending before. Number 3, list all I own and all I owe. He had a list on 2 pages, paper landscape-wise, of these 30 creditors, including the IRS. And then he had next to them how much he owed them altogether. Proverbs 24:3, by wisdom a house is built, and through understanding it is established. He needed a lot of wisdom to deal with this problem. Proverbs 18:13, it is stupid to decide before knowing the facts. So he had the facts in front of him, how much he owed. It involved family, some friends, some businesses, some department stores, some building and supply stores, and bank cards on that list. Number 4, have a sale. Now, this seems silly with as much money as he and his wife owed. But they took that on as, again, a project that was helping them move in a different direction from the old direction. And so the 2 of them, even though they were separated at the time, went through all the stuff they had, and they had several yard sales to get some money because they had almost no income except from the gas company that he was doing. Have a sale. One of the things he did was they had another car besides his company car that was had a pretty good amount of car payment to it, and he went to the car company and he worked out a deal to where he was able to he traded that car in, this pretty new car, and was able to work out the car payments in such a way that was one less burden that he had to deal with. I think he maybe had 3 months to pay, and then he was done with that. And then he bought a little, I think it was a $600 car just to kind of get around town on. The opposite of have a sale here was a couple that was in our church about 25 years ago. And I don't think any of you know them. But he came to me and he said, Seth, we're having problems. We're having financial problems. We're having marital problems. They had They had kids and all different ages, a wide spectrum of age of kids. And so we sat down for lunch and said, well, let's talk about finances. What's your budget? And the thing that I remember most, and looking at his budget, was car payments. Now, again, this is about 25 years ago. This is not today's money. $1,200 for 2 car payments. $600 per car. And they both drove a Mercedes. And I thought, well, hey, this is the easiest thing on this budget. He said, you could go back to the dealer, tell them your situation, and get something, work out something with them to where your car payment can be decreased significantly by if you'll just drive an old beater. And to my absolute shock, neither he nor she was willing to give up their Mercedes. They would rather have lived with that $1,200 per month car payment than give up their prized Mercedes. This is what the Old Testament calls idolatry. Proverbs, Ezekiel 20 verse 7 says, get rid of every idol. Number 5, set up a repayment plan. So he had his list of 30 creditors, including the IRS, and he estimated in pencil how much he would be able to pay each of these creditors on a per month basis. Proverbs 21:5, good planning and hard work lead to prosperity. Now, he started with the ones that had the highest interest, and he was paying more for those guys than he was for the interest-free. And he's had to figure out family and friends, how that was going to work out. And he penciled in so that whenever he was able to pay the highest interest one off first, he would take that amount of payment and knock it down into the second highest interest. That if you've taken the Ramsey course, this is what he calls the debt snowball, to where you're now adding more principal the farther you pay things off. It's a great way to do this. Number 6, cut the time in half. Now, my friend, when I told him this, was kind of like, Seth, I don't think you're living in reality here. Proverbs 18:27, what is impossible with God what is impossible with man is impossible with God. Now, what happened here was just so mind-blowing. I just thought, wow, God, you're just amazing. So here, he's taken these steps to try to get moving in the right direction with this and honor God with his money. And God gave him a job in industrial sales. Instead of pumping gas, he was in industrial sales. It was a total commission job. And God blessed that job like crazy. He had more money coming in from sales in that new job than he had with his former company where he was an owner and partner. And this helped the snowball debt move much quicker. 7, add no new debt. Now, one of the things that I have occasionally dreamed about, and maybe one day I'll do before I die, is getting a credit card in the mail with all of that gobbledygook that you deserve it. And what I want to do is I want to preheat my oven to 450 degrees. And I want to take several credit cards and put them on a cookie sheet and just sort of let them melt into oblivion. And then after they've cooled down, send them back to the banks and say, you can take this, and you fill in the blank there. But I've had a couple women in our church, and if you need this to do it, I'm still open for business, who have given me their credit card, and I keep it up in my locked office because they just don't have the self-control during the course of the month not to use it. Or there have been a couple ladies in our church, I love this idea, took a glass bowl, filled it with water, put their credit cards in the glass bowl, and put it in the bottom shelf of the freezer. Now, in case there's an emergency, you can chip away at that ice and get that card. But you're not going to do any compulsive spending, with an ice pick and a hammer. Be content with what you have. And we're going to talk about this in a few weeks. Contentment. Number 8, share my plan with my creditors. Now, this was one of those, again, one of those things you just sit back and you go, God, I don't know how you do stuff like this. But my friend called every one of the 30 people on his list. Now, the IRS, they were already in communication. But the family, the friends, the department stores, the gas companies, the banks, anything he owed money, he called somebody. And he told them, he gave them this spiel. I am way over my head in debt, but I am determined, and I realize I really messed this up, but I am determined to pay it off. What I'm asking is if you will give me some leniency in terms of my monthly payments. He had and he sent letters out. And he had people on the other end of the phone line that said, Eddie, we've never heard somebody make this kind of call. Or letters that came back, just people like, wow. I mean, it's beyond a business letter. It was a personal letter of just in shock that somebody would want to do this. Because what they were used to getting is a bunch of excuses, and they're just going to have to write it off anyway. Some of them said, just because of your honesty, and they cut some of his principal down on what he owed. And they worked with him. Some of them he didn't pay for a year. Some of them he just paid like $10 a month for a while until the debt snowball kind of got a life of its own. This reminded me of Proverbs 6:7. When your ways please the Lord, he will make your enemies into friends. That's a great verse. And number 9, stick to it. This is a long game. You are playing the long game here. This is not a 30-day wonder kind of thing for the most part if you have the kind of debt that my friend had. Let us not get tired of doing what is right. After a while, we will reap a harvest, a blessing, if we don't get discouraged and give up. Well, those are 9 things you can do. You may not want to do all 9 of them, but generally the idea is that there are ways, to help you chip away from how you used to manage money and establish some new patterns, some new habits of spending. Well, this is the debt trap as we think about it, and we've looked at a bunch of verses where God talks about getting in line with how finances are supposed to be used. But even beyond that, it's getting in line with a different debt that we owe. And all of us as human beings have a human debt that we have. We have a human debt to God. Colossians 2:14 says we owed a debt because we broke God's laws. Now, in our culture, probably the majority of people believe that, okay, I know I'm not perfect and I did some bad things, but my good certainly will outweigh my bad. The Bible says nothing about that. There is no hope of that happening from the Bible's point of view. That is a false hope that you are hoping on. There's a debt. We broke God's laws. That debt listed all the rules we failed to follow. But God forgave us and took away that debt and nailed it to the cross. Every personal debt. Everything that I've ever said to somebody that I shouldn't have said went on that cross. Everything I didn't say to somebody that I should have said went on that cross. Every action I did I shouldn't have done went on that cross. Every action I should have done and didn't went on that cross. Every thought I've ever had that I should not have had went on that cross, including today. And every thought that I should have had that I didn't have went on that cross. That cross is weighted down with tens of thousands of my sins. It is absurd for me to assume that there are some good things I can do that will pay that debt. That is the height of fantasy and flattery. Thankfully, Jesus knows that. And he willingly went to the cross and paid my debt because he loves me. And he loves you. And he doesn't want you to have to walk around with that debt all of your life. And someday, after this life ends, where you realize the total bill is now due and you can't pay it. That's a moment of horror that none of us have to go through. Let's pray together. Maybe you're, as related to this last element of debt, maybe you realize that, Seth, I've always assumed I could overcome my debt to God, by doing a few good things, or even trying to live a good life. And this morning, God has broken through my hard and proud heart and helped me see that's a crock. Thank you that you do love me and you love us, and that you were willing to go to the cross and pay our debt of sin that we owed you. And the invitation is just to come to Jesus as you are with your sin and lay them down at the foot of the cross, metaphorically. And say, God, all my life I've been in charge of me, and that's a terrible idea. And this morning, I want you to sit behind the steering wheel of my life and lead me as you want me to be and how you want me to live. Thank you. Come into my life. And thank you that even now at this moment, I can be cleansed and purified because of the blood of Christ, with a chance to start life all over again. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.